The Galactic Empire kept records of everything. That was the first thing every newly inducted species learned when they signed the Articles of Membership. The Imperium Archivists, a species of soft-bodied, eight-eyed creatures from the Velosian cluster, had been cataloging every known civilization, every known weapon system, every known fleet action for over 4,000 years. Their databases were not just comprehensive, they were considered complete. Senior Archivist Drevas had personally overseen the reclassification of humanity's file less than 2 years ago. The humans had been observed for some time before that, a small, fragile, carbon-based species on a single world at the outer edge of the Orion Spur, technologically primitive by imperial standards, emotionally unstable, prone to self-destructive conflict, biologically unremarkable in almost every measurable way. The file had been thin. Species designation, human. On world, Sol III, local name Earth. Population at last census, approximately 9 billion. Spacefaring capability, limited sublight only at time of first contact, recently transitioned to basic faster than light via purchased Veth drive technology. Military classification, non-threat. Recommended diplomatic approach. Standard absorption protocol, Category 7, peaceful integration with minimal resistance expected. Drevas had stamped that file himself, closed it, filed it. Now, sitting in his observation chamber aboard the Imperial Relay Station at Kepler 442, surrounded by holographic displays showing cascading sensor data and emergency priority transmissions, he was staring at that same file again. Except now, it had a red border around it. A thick, blinking, angry red border that the archive system generated automatically when its threat classification needed to be revised upward. Upward was an understatement. The transmission from Battle Group 7 had stopped 47 minutes ago, not tapered off, not gone to static, stopped, in the middle of a word. Battle Group 7 was not a small force. It was one of the Empire's standard heavy response groups, 7 warships, each ranging from 400 to 900 meters in length, equipped with Tier 3 energy weapons, layered kinetic shielding, point defense lattices, and standard Imperial targeting systems that could lock onto and track a 2-meter object at a range of 800,000 kilometers. The flagship alone, the INS Sovereign Patience, carried a crew of over 4,000 and had served in 3 previous suppression campaigns without taking a single hull breach. They had been dispatched to the Kepler 442 system's 4th orbital shell, a region of space the humans called their outer boundary, to deliver a very simple message. The terms of integration. The standard Imperial packet. Sign here, acknowledge there, surrender your independent fleet command over the next 18 months, and welcome to 2,000 years of peace and prosperity under the Empire's protection. The humans had not responded to the initial hails, which was rude but not unusual for newly contacted species. Sometimes translation protocols took time. Sometimes local governments had internal disagreements about how to respond. Sometimes the species just needed a few days to process the reality that they were no longer alone. Drevas had seen it dozens of times. Admiral Vane Kaz, commanding Battle Group 7, had followed procedure. He had moved his ships into a standard diplomatic formation, close enough to be visible on the humans' long-range sensors, far enough to not be perceived as immediately hostile. He had broadcast the integration offer on 40 different frequency bands, including several that the humans' own early transmissions had used. He had waited the required 48 hours. Then he had received a response. The response had been a single human vessel, just one. It had come out of what the sensors initially classified as a debris field near the 4th planet's trailing Lagrange point, a cluster of rock and ice that the archivist survey teams had not considered worth cataloging. The human ship had been sitting inside that debris field, apparently, for some time. Long enough that it had been radiating almost no heat. Long enough that its drive signature had cooled to near background. Long enough that Imperial sensors, which were very good sensors, had looked right at it and seen rock and ice. The humans called the vessel UNSS Archangel Gabriel. That designation had appeared in one partial transmission before communications had cut out entirely. Drevas pulled up the sensor logs again. He had read them 4 times already. He read them a fifth time because he was a thorough person, and because some part of his brain kept insisting that there was something he had misunderstood. He had not misunderstood anything. The Archangel Gabriel was, by the measurements his sensors had been able to take in the brief window before everything went very wrong, approximately 340 meters in length. Not small for a human vessel, apparently, but by imperial standards it was a mid-sized frigate at best. Lighter than even the smallest ship in Battle Group 7 by a substantial margin. It had not hailed. It had not broadcast any kind of message or warning. It had simply moved, and then it had started killing ships. Captain Yara Os had spent 11 years in the United Nations Space Service before she ever commanded a vessel larger than a patrol cutter. She had spent those 11 years doing the kinds of things that nobody back on Earth thought much about: convoy escort through the asteroid belt, search and rescue in the outer system, one very ugly 18-month deployment during the Mars resource conflicts that she did not talk about at dinner parties. She had been given command of the Archangel Gabriel 14 months ago. The Gabriel was a Prometheus-class heavy frigate, the third of her class, and she was at the time the most advanced warship humanity had ever built. That was not saying much by galactic standards. The UNSS had known that when they built her. They had known it even more after the first Imperial survey drone had passed through the system 8 months into Gabriel's shakedown cruise, taken a very thorough look at everything, and departed without making contact. The briefing that had followed that drone's visit had been the most unsettling 2 hours of Yara's career. The Empire was real. The Empire was large. The Empire was coming, and it was coming with the serene confidence of an organization that had absorbed 412 other species in the last 4,000 years, and had never lost one of those integration campaigns. The Empire was not evil. That was the strange part, the part that kept Yara up at night for weeks afterward. The intelligence analysts and the xeno-diplomats and the political theorists had gone back and forth on it, and their consensus was that the Empire was not malicious. It was just enormous and old and convinced, in the way that very powerful things become convinced, that it knew best. It was going to come, and it was going to offer a choice that was not really a choice, and the integration terms it would present would be permanent and non-negotiable, and would include a clause in paragraph 19 of Section 4 that transferred command authority over all human military assets to the Imperial Joint Fleet Command within 18 months of signing. Earth's governments had debated the response for 6 weeks. In the end, they had reached a conclusion that was, Yara thought, very human. They were not going to fight a war they couldn't win. They understood that. They were not stupid, but they were not going to roll over and sign away their military without demonstrating, very clearly, that humanity had teeth. Because the analysts had also noted something else in the historical record of imperial integrations. Species that came in negotiating from a position of demonstrated strength had consistently received better long-term terms, more autonomy in their internal governance, more flexibility in the implementation of integration clauses, than species that had simply accepted the first offer. Humanity was going to negotiate. And to negotiate from strength, they first needed to demonstrate they had some. Yara had been given a specific objective: not to win, not to destroy the Imperial fleet, just to make very clear in terms that required no translation that absorbing humanity was going to have a cost. She had taken the Gabriel out to the fourth planet's trailing Lagrange point 6 weeks before the Imperial fleet arrived. She had reduced her power signature to the minimum necessary to keep her crew alive. She had tucked herself into the largest concentration of debris and told her crew to get comfortable. Then she had waited. Her crew of 218 had waited with her. She had learned things about her crew in those 6 weeks. Petty Officer Annan did impressions of the senior staff that were uncomfortably accurate. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, her XO, could not actually sleep in 0G no matter what he claimed, and spent most of his rest periods reading old novels on a tablet with the brightness turned all the way down. Chief Engineer Bellamy had apparently brought an acoustic guitar and played it very softly to herself in the engine room at 300 every night for reasons she declined to explain. Ensign Park had a small collection of photographs of her family printed on actual paper, not digital, and she kept them in her left breast pocket at all times. Yara had learned these things because attention to the people around her was something she had always done, not because she thought it was good leadership practice, but because she was genuinely curious about people. This was, several of her commanding officers over the years had told her, both her greatest strength and her most professionally inconvenient trait. She did not disagree. When the Imperial fleet arrived, she watched it through passive sensors only, no active pings, nothing that would give away their position. 7 ships. They were big. They were very, very big, and they moved with the kind of effortless precision that came from 10,000 years of continuous technological refinement. Watching them hold their diplomatic formation, she felt something cold move through her chest. Then she looked at her crew. Petty Officer Annan was at his station, jaw set, hand steady. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez had closed his tablet and was watching his screens with the particular quiet focus she had learned to recognize as his version of calm under pressure. Chief Engineer Bellamy had sent up a status report on all weapon systems that was so thorough and so precise it was almost aggressive. Ensign Park had her hand resting lightly on her console, photographs invisible in her pocket, eyes clear. Yara had looked at all of them and felt the cold thing in her chest turn into something else, something warmer and much more dangerous. She had a job to do. "All right," she had said, in the voice she used when she meant every word to count. "Let's go to work." The Gabriel came out of the debris field at an angle that the Imperial sensors, in their post-action logs, would later describe as tactically incoherent. This was because the Imperial tactical systems had been designed by species that thought about space combat in terms of clear firing lines, established ranges, and the kind of orderly geometry that made sense when your weapons were powerful enough that you could reliably destroy anything at the ranges you were fighting at. When you could kill something from 800,000 kilometers away, there was no particular reason to get close to it. Getting close was unnecessary and somewhat crude. Yara had read everything she could find about Imperial weapons technology, which admittedly wasn't much, and she had come to a conclusion that her tactical officer, Lieutenant Akaffer, had agreed with after 3 days of discussion. The Empire's weapons were better than humanity's at almost every range beyond about 50,000 kilometers. At ranges under 50,000 kilometers, the picture got more complicated. At ranges under 5,000 kilometers, it got very complicated. And at ranges under 1,000 kilometers, Yara was willing to bet her ship and her crew that the Gabriel's weapons, which were shorter ranged and less refined but devastatingly powerful at close quarters, would do things that Imperial targeting systems were not designed to track or respond to in time. This was, she acknowledged privately, not a certain bet. It was an educated guess backed by available data, and a certain amount of desperation fueled optimism. She had been honest about that with her crew. Her crew had voted unanimously to proceed. This had not been a formal vote. The UNSS did not take votes on tactical decisions, but she had asked and they had told her, each in their own way. The Gabriel came out of the debris field running at 112% of rated engine output, which Bellamy had told her was possible for approximately 40 minutes before she would need to start reducing power or risk permanent damage to the drive coils. The Gabriel was also running its electronic countermeasures at maximum output, broadcasting 17 different false signatures simultaneously, and coming in at an angle that kept the bulk of the largest piece of debris between her and the Imperial flagship sensor array for the first 90 seconds of her approach. It was Lieutenant Akaffer who first described what they were doing as a knife fight. He had said it almost to himself, not really meant for anyone to hear, but everyone on the bridge had heard it anyway. The description stuck. The first ship to die was the INS Deliberate Judgment, a 580-meter cruiser positioned on the port flank of the Imperial formation. The Gabriel came in under it, meaning literally under it, on a trajectory that kept her below and inside the Deliberate Judgment's primary gun arcs, and her forward mass drivers put 3 rounds through the cruiser's ventral hull in under 4 seconds. The rounds were not energy weapons. They were kinetic. They were essentially very large metal slugs moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light, and they did not require a targeting lock in the traditional sense, because Yara's crew was operating them manually, on eyeball and sensor correlation, at a range where the error margin was close enough to zero to not matter. The deliberate judgment did not explode. Yara had not expected it to. Ships did not often explode in the way that old entertainment media suggested. What happened was that three very large holes appeared in its hull. Its power systems experienced a catastrophic cascading failure. Its kinetic shielding went down, and its crew, 460 people by Imperial records, lost gravity, atmosphere, and artificial life support in approximately 12 seconds. Imperial shields were designed to stop energy weapons. Directed energy was the Imperial standard. Kinetic impactors at close range were not something the deliberate judgment's point defense had been calibrated to prioritize. This would become a recurring problem for Battle Group 7. The Gabriel did not slow down after the first pass. She rolled and boosted and came around on a trajectory that Akafor was calling out in a rapid, precise monotone that Yara found genuinely soothing. Not because the situation was soothing, because it was categorically not, but because Lieutenant Akafor's voice never changed pitch no matter what was happening around him, and there was something deeply reassuring about that. The second target was the INS Patient Reckoning, a 420-meter destroyer that had begun breaking formation to respond to the deliberate judgment's distress. Breaking formation had been the right instinct. Moving to the angle it had moved to had been a mistake, because the angle it chose put it directly in the Gabriel's path. Yara's secondary guns, twin particle accelerators mounted in rotating dorsal turrets, caught the Patient Reckoning across its midship section. The particle accelerators were not as physically devastating as the mass drivers, but they were faster, and the rotating turrets gave them an effective arc of nearly 200 degrees. The Patient Reckoning's shielding held for approximately 1.5 seconds under sustained fire, which was impressive, and then stopped holding. 43 seconds had passed since the Gabriel left the debris field. On the bridge, no one was talking except Akafor and Chief Weapons Officer Tors, who was running targeting solutions with a quiet intensity that Yara recognized as Tors' version of joy. Tors had grown up in a coastal city that no longer existed due to flooding, had joined the UNSS at 16, and had the kind of focused fury about the state of humanity's situation in the galaxy that, in another time and place, Yara might have considered concerning. Right now she found it extremely useful. Flagship is breaking formation, Akafor said. They're moving to maximum engagement range. They want distance. Don't let them have it, Yara said, working on it. The flagship INS Sovereign Patience was 900 meters of the finest warship the Empire had fielded in this sector, and its captain, Admiral Vane Kaz himself, by Imperial procedure, was doing exactly what you should do when a smaller, faster ship tries to get inside your gun arcs. He was creating distance. At 1,000 kilometers he was disadvantaged. At 100,000 he was not. The Gabriel chased him. This was, Yara knew, the most dangerous part. The Sovereign Patience's rear guns were formidable, and the Gabriel was no longer hiding. 3 of the remaining Imperial ships had now locked onto her and were firing, and her ECM suite was working overtime to make those locks intermittent rather than sustained. And Lieutenant Commander Vasquez was running the defensive countermeasures with a precision that was doing genuinely impressive things given the odds involved. 3 hits got through anyway. The first one took out their starboard sensor cluster, and a compartment that had, 6 weeks earlier, been a small recreation space. No one had been in there. The second one did something to their forward missile tubes that Bellamy, from the engine room, described using language that Yara officially did not hear. The third one hit their secondary communications array, which mattered less than it might have because at this point Yara was not really doing a lot of communicating. Hull breach frames 47 through 51, emergency sealed, Vasquez said. We have casualties. Medical is responding. How many? Still counting. At least 6. Yara processed this and continued doing her job. Senior Archivist Drevos watched the sensor feeds from the relay station with the growing sensation that the floor was slightly tilting beneath him, even though he was in zero gravity and there was no floor. The Gabriel had been under fire from 4 Imperial warships for approximately 12 minutes. It had taken damage. The archivist's best instruments suggested it had taken significant damage, and it was still moving, still maneuvering, still, with what appeared to be baffling stubbornness, refusing to slow down or alter its fundamental tactical approach. 3 Imperial ships were confirmed dead. The deliberate judgment had gone dark. The patient reckoning had lost all power. The INS Careful Advance, which had tried to cut off the Gabriel's angle on the flagship, had experienced what the sensor logs described as a catastrophic internal detonation. A mass driver round had apparently found something critical in the Careful Advance's magazine arrangement, and the result had been sudden and total. The remaining ships were not performing well. Their fire was hitting something that refused to be where it was predicted to be. The Gabriel's captain, whoever she was, seemed to have an instinctive understanding of when an incoming weapon was actually going to connect versus when the firing solution was based on a sensor ghost, and she was moving on that understanding in real time with a responsiveness that the archivist's tactical analysts would spend a long time trying to explain later. Drevos had opened a communication channel to Imperial High Command 18 minutes ago. He was on hold. He realized, quite frightened. Not of the battle, he was not in the battle. He was frightened of what he was going to have to put in the revised file, because the file had said non-threat, and something that was currently killing an Imperial battle group while absorbing return fire and refusing to stop was categorically not that. The fourth ship, the INS Resolute Understanding, tried something that Yara had not anticipated. It stopped firing. It maneuvered between the Gabriel and the Sovereign Patience, placed itself in the direct line of approach, and broadcast on all frequencies, including the human frequencies it had apparently taken the time to identify, a single message. The message was, "Stand down. This engagement is without purpose. Your species will not be harmed." Yara read the translation on her screen. She thought about what it would mean to stand down. She thought about paragraph 19 of section 4. She thought about the 6 casualties Vasquez had confirmed, and the 12 that had since been added to that count. She thought about Ensign Park's photographs. She thought about what kind of position Earth would be in during integration negotiations if she stood down now versus if she did not. Target the Resolute Understanding, she said. Tors had already done it. The Resolute Understanding took a full forward spread at a range of roughly 900 kilometers. At that range, the mass drivers were not precise instruments. They were very large hammers, and the Resolute Understanding was something that could, under these circumstances, be treated like a nail. The Resolute Understanding stopped broadcasting. 4 ships. The Sovereign Patience had reached what Admiral Vane Kaz clearly considered a comfortable distance. The remaining 2 ships, a destroyer and a smaller cruiser, had pulled back to flank the flagship in a defensive triangle. This was correct defensive doctrine, Yara acknowledged. At this range, with this formation, the Sovereign Patience's main batteries could probably kill the Gabriel in 2 or 3 sustained hits. Probably. They're going to hold that range, Akafor said. I see it. If they're patient. They're not going to be patient, Yara said. Akafor looked at her. They've lost 4 ships in under 20 minutes to a vessel that should not be able to hurt them, she said. They are not going to just sit there and wait. They're going to come to us because they need this to be over. She was right. She was right because she understood something about the psychology of command that had less to do with species and more to do with the nature of leadership itself. That when things go catastrophically wrong in ways that contradict your entire model of how the universe works, the instinct is not to sit still and think carefully. The instinct is to do something, to regain control, to impose your will on the situation and make it stop being wrong. Admiral Vane Kaz lasted 9 minutes in that holding position. Then the Sovereign Patience began to advance. Bellamy, Yara said. Still here, Captain. The chief engineer's voice came back, slightly ragged. Drive coils are at 81% efficiency and dropping. Forward missile tubes are gone. We've got a coolant leak in Section 3 that's going to be a problem in about 20 minutes. What do you need? I need you to do something that's going to sound unreasonable. A brief pause. That's my favorite kind of thing. When I give you the word, I need a full emergency stop. Everything you can pull into reverse thrust simultaneously. Another pause longer. That's going to stress the frames pretty hard. I know. We might lose the port drive entirely. I know. Captain, if we lose the port drive, we are not going anywhere under our own power. I know, Yara said, when I say the word. She heard Bellamy breathe out slowly. Ready when you are. The sovereign patience was big, and it was powerful, and it was coming at her with the kind of committed momentum that 900 meters of warship accumulated when it decided to move. Its main batteries were cycling up. She could read the power signature on her sensors. It was going to fire at approximately 300,000 kilometers. At 300,000 kilometers, the Gabriel's ECM had maybe a 40% chance of breaking any given targeting lock, and the Sovereign Patience was going to fire multiple shots, and Yara did not love those odds. So she was not going to be where the Sovereign Patience expected her to be. Akafar, she said. Heading 270 by positive 31 maximum thrust mark. The Gabriel accelerated, toward the flagship, directly toward it. The Sovereign Patience fired. 3 shots. Energy weapons. The Imperial Standard Coherent Beam type. They were very good shots. They were going to intersect the Gabriel's predicted position at exactly the moment the Gabriel would have been there if it had continued on its previous heading. The Gabriel was not there. It had changed course with a sharpness that Yara's G-force dampeners handled 90% of, and her crew handled the remaining 10% of by holding onto things. The shots went wide. Not by much. The nearest one left a scorched line across the Gabriel's aft sensor pod that Vasquez reported with admirable calm. Coming into their optimal range in 40 seconds, Akafar said. The Sovereign Patience was firing again. Faster cycle this time. The Admiral had realized he had missed. 2 of the next volley connected. The Gabriel shuddered. Something in the deck plating beneath Yara's feet buckled and then repressurized. Vasquez was talking, and she processed his damage report the way she processed all information in moments like this, fully, cleanly, filed and acted on and moved past. The Gabriel was inside 200,000 kilometers now, inside 150, 100. Now, Yara said, and Bellamy did something extraordinary with the drive coils. The Gabriel stopped, not slowed, stopped. In the span of about 3 seconds, using every newton of reverse thrust the ship could produce plus some that it probably shouldn't have tried to produce, the Gabriel went from significant forward velocity to near zero. The frames groaned. An alarm went off that Yara had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. 3 people on the bridge lost their footing, and one of them, she learned later, broke 2 ribs. The Sovereign Patience's targeting solution, calculated for an object moving at the Gabriel's previous velocity, put the predicted intersection point about 12,000 kilometers ahead of the Gabriel's actual position. The shots went into empty space. The Gabriel, now essentially stationary relative to the flagship, was at a range of approximately 80,000 kilometers and closing slowly as the flagship's own momentum continued to carry it forward. At 80,000 kilometers, the Gabriel's mass drivers were not operating at peak efficiency, but they were operating. And Tors, who had grown up in a city that no longer existed and had joined the UNSS at 16, had been waiting for exactly this moment. The first round hit the Sovereign Patience's forward shield array. The second hit its primary targeting sensor. The third, fourth, and fifth rounds hit in close enough succession that the flagship's damage control systems, which were designed to handle one serious problem at a time, experienced what an Imperial engineer would later describe in a report as a cascading prioritization failure. The Sovereign Patience did not die quickly. It was too big and too well built for that. But it stopped firing and it stopped maneuvering, and the 2 remaining ships, the destroyer and the small cruiser, broke away from their formation and began accelerating out of the system. Yara watched them go. She did not pursue. She had not been tasked to destroy a fleet. She had been tasked to make a point. The point had been made with, she thought, reasonable clarity. Bellamy, she said. Yeah. The chief engineer's voice was tired. Port drive is gone, told you. You did. How bad is everything else? A long pause. She could hear Bellamy moving around down there, checking things, counting. We're alive, Bellamy said finally. Everything else is negotiable. Yara leaned back in her command chair. She became aware gradually that her hands were shaking slightly. She put them flat on her armrests. Akafar, she said, get me a count on the flagship. Is it drifting or is it still powered? Still powered, minimal power. I think they're on emergency systems. Any life signs? Can't get a clean read at this range with our sensors in this state. Best guess is yes. Yara nodded slowly. Open a channel, full broadcast all frequencies. Vasquez from his station got the communications array working. It took about 45 seconds. One of the secondary arrays had survived intact. Channel open, he said. Yara looked at her screen. She thought about what to say. She thought about what she needed them to hear and what she needed them to take back to whoever was listening. She spoke for 2 minutes. She spoke carefully and clearly, and she did not raise her voice. She said that humanity had no interest in destroying the Empire's ships or the Empire's people. She said that the Archangel Gabriel had done what it had done not as an act of war, but as a demonstration that humanity existed, that humanity had chosen to exist on its own terms, and that the cost of ignoring that choice was something the Empire should now be in a position to calculate. She said that Earth's governments were ready to discuss integration terms. They were interested in a partnership, genuinely interested, and they believed that the Empire and humanity had things to offer each other. But the terms currently on the table were not acceptable, and the humans were not going to sign them, and the Empire should understand that humanity was the kind of species that would make good on that position. She said she hoped everyone aboard the remaining Imperial vessels was alive and that she wished them no harm. Then she closed the channel. The bridge was very quiet. Vasquez, she said, get me a full casualty report and get medical to send someone to wherever Ensign Park is stationed. Park is fine, Captain. She reported in 14 minutes ago. Yara felt something release in her chest that she had not realized she was holding. Good. Still send someone. Senior Archivist Drevas had been on hold with Imperial High Command for 4 hours when someone finally answered. The someone was not who he had expected. He had expected an administrative coordinator, a lower-level intake officer, someone in the standard routing chain who would take his emergency report and pass it up the appropriate channels with the appropriate priority flags. Instead, he found himself looking at the face of Fleet Admiral Sorth Vaughn, Supreme Commander of the Imperial 7th Fleet, which had operational authority over this entire sector. Sorth Vaughn had 4 eyes, all of them fixed on Drevas with an expression that the senior archivist would have described as controlled devastation if he had been asked to describe it, which he was not. Tell me, Sorth Vaughn said, that your sensor readings are corrupted. They are not corrupted, Drevas said. Sorth Vaughn closed all 4 eyes simultaneously. This was an Orthan expression that roughly translated to accepting unwelcome reality. Drevas had time to observe this and to note, almost academically, that he had never in 42 years of service seen a fleet admiral make that expression. 1 vessel, Sorth Vaughn said. 1 vessel, Drevas confirmed. Classification. The humans designated a heavy frigate. By mass and configuration, it would be equivalent to an Imperial light frigate, approximately Category 4. And it destroyed 5 ships of Battle Group 7. 4 destroyed, confirmed. 1, the flagship, is crippled and adrift. It has since broadcast a distress signal, and I believe it is being assisted by its 2 surviving companion vessels, which withdrew from the engagement approximately 90 minutes ago. Another silence. Sorth Vaughn opened his eyes. And the human vessel. Still in the system. It is also damaged, significantly damaged by our readings. It does not appear capable of faster than light travel at this time. It has not moved since the engagement ended. It has, however, broadcast a message. I was told about the message. Then you know the content. I know the content. The Fleet Admiral's expression shifted into something that Drevas found harder to read. Not anger exactly, not fear, something more complex than either of those. Archivist. You classified this species as a non-threat. Drevas had been waiting for this. He had been dreading it and preparing for it simultaneously for the last several hours. I classified this species based on the information available at the time of classification, he said, keeping his voice steady with some effort. Their technology profile was below Imperial standard across all measured categories. Their military assets, as observed by survey, were minimal. Their behavior patterns suggested internal conflict rather than external aggression. The classification was made in good faith according to established protocols. The protocols, Sorth Vaughn said, apparently did not account for a Category 4 vessel defeating a heavy response group in under an hour. No, Drevas agreed. They did not. The Fleet Admiral looked at something off-screen for a moment. I need a revised threat assessment. I have one prepared, Drevas said. He had been working on it during the 4 hours on hold. It was thorough. It was also, he privately felt, inadequate to the situation, because the situation was one that his analytical framework was still struggling to contain. The honest answer, Admiral, is that we do not yet understand what we are dealing with. We know what the humans did. We do not know the extent to which it represents their normal capability, an exceptional individual, or something in between. We do not have good data on their other military assets. We do not know how many vessels of this type exist. What do we know? Drevos considered. We know that their captain chose to broadcast a message rather than pursue the surviving ships. We know that the message was not a declaration of war. We know that they are, apparently, interested in negotiation. He paused. We also know that they sat in a debris field for 6 weeks, undetected, waiting for our fleet to arrive, which suggests a level of patience and tactical planning that our initial assessment did not account for. Soreth Vaughn was quiet for a moment. What would you recommend? It was not normal for a fleet admiral to ask a senior archivist for strategic recommendations. Drevos noted this. I would recommend, he said carefully, that we treat this as a contact situation rather than a suppression situation. I would recommend that we initiate communication with the human vessel currently in the Kepler 442 system at the first opportunity, and that we approach those communications without assuming a position of total superiority. He paused again. I would also recommend that we revise our integration offer substantially before those communications begin. The fleet admiral looked at him for a long moment. How substantially? Soreth Vaughn said. Do you mean? I mean, Drevos said, that paragraph 19 of section 4 should be tabled entirely. Captain Yara Osai had been awake for 31 hours when the Imperial transmission arrived. She was aware of being 31 hours awake the way you are aware of something that is true and cannot be changed, and should simply be noted and set aside. She had a mug of coffee, actual coffee, ground from actual beans, her one genuine personal luxury aboard the Gabriel, and she was sitting in her command chair reading casualty reports when Vasquez told her there was an incoming transmission from the direction of the relay station at the system's edge. What kind of transmission? She asked. It's on the standard hailing frequencies. It's actually, Captain, it's on the frequencies from their integration offer. The ones they broadcast before the engagement. Yara set down the coffee. Put it through. The voice that came through the communications array spoke in a language that the Gabriel's translation protocols handled smoothly. The Empire had apparently been transmitting translation keys along with its broadcasts for months, which the humans had quietly catalogued. The voice said, UNSS Archangel Gabriel, this is Senior Archivist Drevos of the Imperial Galactic Archive, transmitting from Kepler 442 Relay Station. We have received your captain's message. We are prepared to open a dialogue. Please respond at your earliest convenience. It was a reasonable message. It was a polite message. It was the kind of message that suggested the sender had spent some time thinking about how to begin a conversation that they had not anticipated needing to have. Yara looked at Vasquez. Vasquez looked at her. Earliest convenience, she said. That's what they said. Open a channel. The conversation between Yara Osai and Drevos lasted, in total, 4 hours over 2 sessions separated by a 6-hour break during which both parties consulted with their respective superiors. Yara's consultation involved a 40-minute compressed transmission to Earth that took into account the light speed delay and left most of the actual decision-making in her hands because her orders had anticipated this scenario and given her broad authority to respond. She appreciated that. Drevos's consultation involved conversations that she was not privy to but that, judging by his demeanor when the second session began, had produced some changes in his position. The first session was exploratory. Both parties asking questions, establishing vocabulary, working out what could and couldn't be translated directly, and what required longer explanations. Drevos asked about the Gabriel's capabilities, framing it neutrally, academically. Yara answered honestly about what she could answer honestly and declined to answer the questions she preferred not to answer, and she told him clearly when she was declining and why. He seemed to appreciate this. She asked him about the integration protocols. He explained them, the entire history, 412 species, 4,000 years, the general philosophy and the specific mechanisms. She listened carefully. She asked about species that had negotiated better terms. He told her about 3 that had, and the circumstances around those negotiations. She noticed that all 3 had, at some point, demonstrated to the Empire that they were capable of making integration expensive. In the second session, Drevas came with what he called a revised framework. The revised framework did not include paragraph 19 of Section 4. It did include a provision for joint military exercises rather than absorption of command authority. It included a longer integration timeline, 12 years instead of 18 months. It included a cultural exchange protocol and an economic partnership structure that, when Yara transmitted the summary to Earth, produced a return message from the Secretary General's office that included the phrase, considerably more acceptable. It was not everything. There were still clauses that Earth's government would argue over, provisions that would require years of further negotiation, details that would be fought over in committee rooms and diplomatic sessions long after Yara had returned to Sol. Integration was still happening. The Empire was still large, and the Empire was still old, and the relationship between humanity and the Galactic Empire was going to be complicated and unequal for a long time. But it was going to be a negotiation. A real one between parties who understood what the other was capable of. That was something. At the end of the second session, after the broad strokes of the revised framework had been agreed upon as a basis for further discussion, Drevas paused. He seemed to be organizing a question that he had been sitting with for a while. "Captain Osai," he said, "archivist, you had an advantage in this engagement. You understood the nature of our weapon systems, that they were designed for different ranges than what you chose to fight at. You understood that our response would be constrained by our standard doctrine. You had clearly done a great deal of preparation." "We had," Yara agreed. "What I would like to understand," Drevas said, "is something that our databases cannot tell us. When your crew agreed to attempt this engagement, with full understanding of the odds, with full knowledge of what a battle group 7 times the mass of your vessel could theoretically do to you, what was the deciding factor? What made them say yes?" Yara thought about this for a moment. She thought about Petty Officer Anand and his impressions. She thought about Vasquez reading novels in the dark. She thought about Bellamy and her guitar. She thought about Ensign Park's paper photographs. "I don't think there was one factor," she said finally. "I think different people had different reasons. Some of them were angry. There's a lot of anger in humanity right now when we look at what's happening and what's been proposed. Some of them were scared and decided to do it anyway because they thought it mattered. Some of them trusted me, or trusted each other, or just decided that this was the moment that counted and they wanted to be present for it." She paused. "I think for most of them it came down to the fact that they couldn't see another way to make sure their families would be okay. Their kids, their parents, whoever they were doing it for. That's a very human thing. We are very specifically motivated by the people immediately around us." Drevas was quiet for a moment. "Our files noted that humans are prone to internal conflict, that you fight among yourselves frequently." "We do," Yara said. "How do you reconcile that with what you just described?" "This cohesion," Yara considered. "I think it's the same thing, actually. We fight with each other because we care about things and we disagree about how to protect them. And when something external threatens what we care about, we stop fighting with each other, at least temporarily, and we point in the same direction." She paused. "We're not always good at it. We don't always manage it in time. But when we do manage it, we tend to be pretty effective." Drevas was quiet for another moment. Then unexpectedly, he said, "I made an error in your classification." "I know," Yara said. "The framework I used did not account for the factors you are describing. Our assessment protocols measure technology, population, resource base. They do not have good metrics for," he paused, searching for the word, "for willingness." "No," Yara said, "I imagine that's hard to measure." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I will be revising the assessment protocols." "Good idea." The Gabriel was in the Kepler 442 system for 11 more days before a human rescue and salvage vessel arrived to assist with repairs. In those 11 days, Yara's crew did several things. They made emergency repairs to the most critical systems, enough to restore environmental stability throughout the ship, and to get 3 of the 4 main drive units back to partial function. They completed a full accounting of their casualties. 18 people had been injured in the engagement, 3 of them seriously. One person, able spacer Renata Flores of the engineering deck, had died from injuries sustained in the second major hit the Gabriel took. She was 24 years old and she had grown up in Guadalajara, and she had wanted to eventually become a navigator. Yara wrote the letter to Flores's family herself. She always wrote these letters herself. It did not become easier with practice, and she had never wanted it to. She also spent several more hours in conversation with Drevas. After the formal negotiations were handed off to the proper diplomatic channels, Earth had dispatched an actual diplomat, Ambassador Chiara Adami, on the rescue vessel. The conversations between Yara and Drevas became less formal, less structured. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she enjoyed them. Drevas was a thorough person. He asked careful questions. He listened to the answers with what she could tell, even across a radio delay and a translation layer, was genuine attention. He had spent 42 years cataloging civilizations, and he had a sense of wonder about the variety of ways that sapient life organized itself that reminded her, a little, of herself. He asked about Earth, not the geopolitical structure or the military assets or the economic output, the things that were in his files. He asked about the planet itself, what it looked like, what lived there, whether it had seasons. Yara told him about the planet. She told him about mountains and oceans, and she told him about a forest she had walked in as a child that had smelled like something she could not describe and had never been able to duplicate anywhere else in her experience of the universe. She told him about the particular quality of late afternoon light on the coast near where she had grown up in Ghana, golden and heavy and warm in a way that she carried with her in some internal pocket that she could access whenever she needed to. Drevas listened to all of this with his careful attention. "You miss it," he said. "Constantly," Yara said. "That's a human thing too. We are very attached to specific places." "Our files noted that," he said. "It was listed as a potential vulnerability." Attachment to home world as leverage point in negotiations. Yara felt something sharp move through her at that, and then she let it go. "I know, it's a real thing. It's more than that. It's not just a vulnerability. It's a reason. It's why we do things." "Yes," Drevas said. "I think I am beginning to understand that." The salvage vessel arrived on the 11th day. It was the UNSS Endurance, a heavy logistics ship that had been redirected from a supply run to the outer system colonies, and it came in with the slightly frantic energy of a vessel that had been told to drop everything and go somewhere immediately, and had done exactly that. Commander T. Yang Kim, the Endurance's captain, came aboard the Gabriel in person, which was not technically standard protocol for a salvage assist, but which Yara appreciated enormously. He was a large man with a calm demeanor that reminded her of the ocean on a clear day, and he walked through her ship with the expression of someone doing a lot of math and keeping his reactions very controlled. "Well," he said when the tour was finished and they were standing in what remained of the forward section. "You've had a time." "We have had a time," Yara agreed. He looked at her. "How's the crew? Alive, tired, mostly holding together." "Good." He paused. It's a lot right now, back home. Everyone knows what happened. The news has been it's a lot." He seemed to search for the right way to describe it and couldn't quite find one. "People are feeling things," he said finally. Yara nodded. She had gotten some sense of this from the official communications. The unofficial ones, the personal messages her crew had been receiving from family and friends, had given her a much clearer picture. The word the messages kept using in about 30 different languages was proud. "We did what we were sent to do," she said. "You did considerably more than what you were sent to do," Kim said without inflection. "The situation required it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the scorched and patched walls of her ship. "Ambassador Adami is aboard," he said. "She'd like to talk to you before she heads over to the relay station." "I'll make time." She's been in contact with the archivist, the one you've been talking to. Drevas. "Right, she says he's been helpful." "More helpful than the initial diplomatic assessment expected." He glanced at her. "She says he specifically requested that she pass along his regards to you." Yara smiled, and it was a real one. "I'll send mine back." Kim nodded. He started to move toward the hatch and then stopped. He turned around. "Captain Osai," he said. "I've been in the service for 22 years. I've never been in combat." I've spent 22 years moving cargo and logistics, and I have not complained about it because someone has to do it and I am good at it and I believe in what we're doing." He paused. "But I just walked through your ship." He looked at her steadily. "Whatever you did out here," he said, "it mattered. The terms on the table now, Ambassador Adami showed me the revised framework on the way in, compared it to the original offer. It's different. It's substantially different. In 20 years, when my grandkids are growing up in whatever relationship humanity has with this empire, that difference is going to mean something." He paused again. "I just wanted to say that." Yara looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I'll tell the crew." The file in Drevas's archive was revised 3 more times in the months that followed. The first revision updated the threat classification from non-threat to Category 8 significant military capability demonstrated. This was the highest category classification that could be applied to a non-imperial species, and it triggered automatic review protocols that resulted in 4 separate audit teams, spending 3 months going over every assessment that Drevas had made in the last decade. They found nothing else problematic. This was both a relief and, in a quiet way that Drevas chose not to examine too closely, slightly deflating. The second revision added a cultural and behavioral assessment that ran to 43 pages, and that Drevas wrote primarily himself, staying late in the archive for several weeks to do it. The assessment covered things that standard imperial protocols did not usually cover in this kind of detail: the human relationship to place and home, the way that human social bonds operated under stress, the specific psychological mechanism by which a species that was frequently in internal conflict could mobilize with remarkable cohesion when presented with an external threat. He noted that this mechanism was not unique to humans, but was more pronounced in them than in most species he had encountered. He noted also, in a section that he marked as personal observation and not formal assessment, that humans appeared to have a relationship to individual mortality that was distinct from most sapient species he had studied. They knew they would die, and they chose to do things anyway. They chose to care about things, knowing they would not always be able to protect those things. This was not, he wrote carefully, irrational. It was something else. He did not have a word in Orthan for what it was. He left a blank in the text and wrote a note to himself to ask Captain Osai whether there was a human word for it. He asked her later during one of their intermittent communications. She thought about it for a while. "Courage," she said finally. "But that's not quite it either. Courage is the thing you feel when you do something despite being afraid. What you're describing is more. It's knowing that things are going to end and choosing to love them anyway. We don't have a perfect word for that. We have poems about it mostly." Drevas added this exchange to the file. The third revision updated the population figures and the technology profile, which had changed since first contact, and added the preliminary terms of the integration and partnership framework that Ambassador Adami and the Imperial diplomatic team had spent 8 months negotiating. The framework was, by Imperial historical standards, unusual. It preserved human independent command of human military assets for an indefinite period, subject to joint consultation mechanisms and a mutual defense clause. It established economic and scientific exchange programs. It created a formal diplomatic channel that was graded differently from the standard absorption pipeline, not because humans were granted special status, officially, but because the framework had been designed to acknowledge, in language that was carefully diplomatic and therefore did not say this directly, that the first conversation between humanity and the Empire had established a certain precedent, species that the Empire had records of. And then there was this other category. Yara received a commendation from the United Nations Security Council. She was promoted to Commodore. She gave a speech that she worked on for 3 weeks because she wanted it to be honest, and she was aware that it was going to be listened to by a lot of people who were feeling things. She stood at a podium in Geneva, and she said that 18 people from her crew had been hurt, and 1 had not come home, and she said Renata Flores's name clearly, and let it sit in the room for a moment before she said anything else. She said that what her crew had done was not about heroism. She said that word got used a lot in situations like this, and she was not sure it was always the right word. She said that what she had observed was something simpler and maybe more important, people deciding that the thing in front of them mattered enough to show up for it and do their jobs with everything they had. She said she thought that was something humanity did well when it led itself. She got a standing ovation. She stood at the podium and waited for it to end, and then she finished her speech and went back to her seat and thought about an acoustic guitar in an engine room at 300 and photographs in a left breast pocket, and a tactical officer whose voice never changed pitch no matter what was happening, and she was quiet for a while. In the months that followed, she had several conversations with various government officials, think tanks, strategic analysts, and 2 different documentary film crews about what had happened in the Kepler 442 system. She answered the questions that she could answer and declined the ones she preferred not to answer, clearly and without excessive explanation. She did not become a public figure in the way that some of her advisors suggested she could, because she did not want that, and because she had a sense that becoming a symbol was a way of becoming something other than what she was, and what she was more useful. She was given command of a second vessel, the UNSS Archangel Michael, a new ship of a new class that incorporated several technological improvements that had been developed partly in response to what the Gabriel's engagement logs had demonstrated about effective close-range combat doctrine. She took her commission, and she assembled a crew, and she took the Michael out to the outer system for shakedown exercises. She stopped once in the area of the 4th planet's trailing Lagrange point. Just briefly, the debris field was still there. Her passive sensors found no evidence that anyone had disturbed it. She sat there for a few minutes and looked at where her ship had hidden for 6 weeks, and she thought about what it had felt like to wait. Then she flew on. Drevos retired from the Imperial Archive 7 years after the events at Kepler 442. He had spent those 7 years doing what he had always done, cataloging, assessing, revising files, training junior archivists, presiding over the endless administrative machinery of trying to understand and record the staggering diversity of life in the galaxy. He had also spent a significant portion of that time following the progress of human-imperial relations, with an attention that his colleagues occasionally teased him about. The integration was messy. It was going to be messy for a long time. There were disputes over resource rights and jurisdictional questions, and a substantial ongoing argument about the cultural exchange program that seemed to generate roughly 1 crisis per quarter. The Mutual Defense Clause had been invoked once in a minor border situation, and the joint consultation mechanisms were, by every honest account, producing meetings that were very long and sometimes contentious. It was nothing like the clean, orderly absorption that standard imperial protocols were designed to produce. Drevos found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred it this way. At his retirement ceremony, a modest affair, an archivist's ceremony, quiet people in a quiet building on the imperial capital world, he gave a brief address to the junior staff assembled. He told them that the fundamental work of an archivist was to understand, and that understanding was harder than it looked, and that the most important lesson he had learned in 49 years of service was that you should be very careful about which things you assumed your models were capturing. He told them that there were things in the universe that did not fit in any category that existed before you encountered them. He told them that when you encountered one of those things, the correct response was to sit with the uncertainty, be honest about what you did not know, and begin revising. One of the junior archivists asked him, after the formal part of the ceremony was over, whether he had any regrets. He thought about this carefully. "I regret," he said, "that my initial assessment was wrong. That is a genuine regret. The error had consequences, and I do not dismiss that." He paused. "I do not regret what came of the correction. Contact with a species that our models did not predict has made this institution better at its work. That is not nothing." "What is the most important thing you learned?" the junior archivist asked. She was young, newly certified, with the particular focused energy of someone at the beginning of their career. Drevos thought about this for longer. He thought about a planet with mountains and oceans and late afternoon light. He thought about acoustic guitars at 300 and paper photographs in breast pockets. He thought about a captain sitting in a command chair with shaking hands held flat against armrests, speaking clearly into a channel, choosing her words. "I learned," he said, that a species with every measurable disadvantage can still be very difficult to predict if what they have unmeasured is the willingness to sit in a debris field for 6 weeks on the chance that it might matter. He paused. I learned that willingness is not nothing. In fact, it might be the variable that everything else depends on. He retired 2 weeks later and moved to a small research post near the edge of the Velocian cluster, and spent the next 12 years writing a book on the philosophy of species classification that was later assigned reading for every incoming archivist class, and that contained, in its final chapter, a lengthy footnote about a planet called Earth and a warship called the Archangel Gabriel, and the limits of what a database could know. The footnote ended with a sentence that his students later quoted frequently, in context and out of it, which Drevas had always considered a reasonable measure of whether a thing was worth saying. The sentence was, "The record has no entry for what a species is willing to do, only for what it has done, and these are not the same thing." Yara Os commanded vessels in the UNSS for 19 more years. She retired with the rank of Fleet Admiral and was one of the principal architects of what became known as the Kepler Accords, the foundational framework governing human imperial relations for the next century. She is reported to have said, at her own retirement ceremony, that the thing she was most proud of was not the battle but the conversation that came after it. Renata Flores is memorialized on the roll of service maintained at the UNSS headquarters in Geneva. She was 24 years old. The Archangel Gabriel was repaired and returned to service. She served for 11 more years before being decommissioned and placed in the Naval Museum at Lunar Station Alpha, where she remains. There is a plaque near her forward mast driver batteries. It was written by Petty Officer Annan, who by the time of the decommissioning was a chief petty officer and had been asked by the crew to compose something. He wrote, "She had one fight and it counted. 6 words." The committee in charge of the plaque had wanted something longer. He had declined to provide anything longer. He had pointed out, with the kind of patience that comes from many years of service, that 6 words were sufficient, and that making something longer just to make it longer was the kind of thing that missed the point. The committee had agreed with him.